Okay, the doors are open. People are arriving. And we're excited today, very excited today. I don't want to jump the gun. Want to let a few more people get in before we officially start.
Well, keeping time in mind, I'm going to welcome everyone to the Pandemic, Racial Disparity, Awareness and Understanding, a Fireside Chat provided by the PA Care Partnership in association with the Office of Mental Health and Substance Abuse Services, which is also known as OMSAS. Today is an in-depth and critical conversation as we begin to unpack how race affects outcomes for families. We will also, through discussion, potentially challenge current norms and reflect on our need to be more thoughtful and inclusive. Learn the distinct ways diversity, equity, and inclusion are uniquely different but necessary to increase an intentional engagement. This session will allow participants to go on a personal reflective journey while gaining unique tools to serve all families more effectively. During the presentation, please type your questions into the Q&A feature, which you will find by running your mouse along the bottom of the Zoom screen. And when you put your questions in the Q&A, please let us know if you want to ask your questions live with audio and or video. Today's moderators are part of the PA Care Partnership team. Myself, Jamal Ford, I will be monitoring the Q&A. We have Nancy Massey, who is our chat monitor, and Mark Durgan, the director of our grant, who I will turn it over to.
All right, so welcome all, and it's with a great pleasure I get to introduce our today's speaker, Lisa Kennedy. I had the opportunity to work with, I guess technically for Lisa over 6 or 7 years, I guess at this point. Lisa comes to us from York County. She's a family peer support specialist with the York County Human Services Department located in York, Pennsylvania. She has been serving families in this role for over 3 years and has worked with families for about 25 years in total, including serving with the local school board. Lisa transitioned from the corporate world of a hospital administrative management into human services after she became a foster parent many years ago. Lisa has had successfully created several programs to serve families in meaningful ways. In this, Lisa really believes in the state of Black and Brown mental health, and it's how it's becoming a fast growing and rewarding work that is intersecting the world of mental health and all of the systems to focus on the impact of how communities of color are affected both by the pandemic and by services in general. We have I've enjoyed the opportunity of working with Lisa in various roles, like I said, for many years. Lisa's created also some really great programs, including some areas to focus on family engagement and involvement. She's also has a regular series with our state leadership and management team doing cultural and linguistic competency training. We actually have about a 20-minute presentation or a little bit longer every month that Lisa has chaired, and it's been absolutely impactful. And Lisa is also one of our family member tri-chairs for our state leadership and management team. Her work in York County and across Pennsylvania has impacted many families of youth and young adults with mental health diagnosis. And I can say this truly, that she really is an inspiration to all that she encounters. And with that, it's my great honor to present Lisa. Welcome.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Mark, Jamal, and Nancy, for such kind words. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today. I'm really excited. This is a topic that I have been covering for more than 20 plus years, and really specifically focusing on, in the last probably 3-4 years, the impact of crucial conversations about race and mental health, and as it intersects across all of our systems. So I appreciate the time Mark took to share a little bit of my story with you, and I'll give you a little bit more tidbit along the way when the presentation gets started. But I want to welcome everyone, and I see everyone is really hitting the chat box with their introduction. So there's a slide for that, but it looks like we might be able to skip over that slide. I do have a lot of slides to share with you today, but I'm also really going to strongly encourage conversation, because this is really an interactive, or my intent is for this to be a really interactive session, because I want to hear from you. And as much as we're coming together for you all to hear from me and share information and experiences and lots of data at some point, I really want to hear from you, because we all in some capacity serve families in one way or another. And collectively, we are better when we engage with one another and learn from one another. And as Mark said, I am one of those family members, and I'll be able to tell you a little bit about my story. And along the way, as I share different experiences with you, they will in part be either from my journey or things that I've seen along the way within systems. So let's go ahead and get started. Oops, it jumped and I didn't realize it. All right, so everyone's already taken to the chat box and doing that, but if you are just joining us, we welcome you again. If you would take the opportunity and please place in the chat box your organization that you're representing today and your role. And if you are not from Pennsylvania, because as the names are rolling through, I'm seeing some folks from all across the country. So please feel free to share your state if you happen to not be from Pennsylvania. That's exciting. And so welcome to everyone, and continue using that chat box to share. It'll also provide us with attendance. And then I'll also say for the Q&A and or comments, please use the chat box for that feature. And Jamal and Nancy will be covering that as well. So Mark shared a little bit with you about my story, but I am a mother of 4 adult children, a single parent. I have 5 grandchildren. My oldest grandchild is 16. My youngest is 9 months. I've been a family peer specialist for a little over 3 years now, but I've been serving families for well over 25 years in one capacity or another, whether that was advocacy, whether that was representing families and supporting families and teams, whether that was facilitating training. So in many roles I've served. I currently am serving as chair on, I think immediately off the top of my head, 4 mental health committees across the state and locally here in York, but also across the state. I am currently serving in my 2nd term as the vice president of the school district of City of York School Board. So I am all about education as well. I currently am chairing a racial equity investment fund, and what that means is I chair this fund for the York County Community Foundation that specifically serves those organizations and groups that are doing work in this lane of racial equity, and I manage a $500,000 grant program for that. I am the family tri-chair, as Mark shared, of the State Leadership and Management Team, which connects to systems of care. And we have many counties across the state that function in that. And then I do some other kinds of trainings and that kind of thing. So that's a quick overview of a little bit about my story. So you have a better understanding of the lens that I'll be coming from and some of the things I share with you today. So today, here are some things that we're going to cover. We're going to define some terms so that we all have a foundation of understanding that we're working with from the same premise. I'm going to share some data with you across many different areas that may surprise you or may not surprise you. However, I think you will be on the end of being surprised by some of the things that you might see. There'll be some opportunities for group discussion using the chat box and the Q&A. We'll talk about the impact of COVID and the pandemic on communities of color primarily, and then we'll talk about just the impact of COVID on everyone collectively. We'll share some critical differences between understanding equality and equity and really hone in on what those differences are and make sure that there's some clarity there so that we can begin to sort of take a look at how we are addressing within our systems thing called equity. And then one thing I can guarantee you is that we will be stirring some emotions and considering some core beliefs. And so I encourage you to lean into this presentation today with an open mind and an open heart, and enjoy the time we have together. So one of the first things I like to do is really sort of talk about some group norms and some conversation norms. And usually when I'm doing this presentation or doing this work with groups and agencies, it really isn't done in a formal presentation with a PowerPoint, because there are different ways to look at this. And what I'm really going for in most cases is digging deeper. And most of us who serve in organizations and agencies, we typically have that checklist of trainings that we all must do every year. And typically there's something in that world of CLC or DEI on the broader level. And that's really more of a presentation style. But what we're going to do today is attempt to take that process and dig a little deeper, challenge you a little bit more to think about the way in which you move through the world as an individual, but also how those we serve move through the world, and how the two intersect, and then what we need to think about and consider along the way. So in those norms, I'm asking you to suspend judgment. So we're all here to learn. And while I'm here leading this presentation, I'm an expert only in my own personal experience. And so that is what I leave with you today is that there's a lot of expertise in this room, and all of you possess that as well. So my expertise is going to be in my own journey, my own experience, and my own knowledge, and yours will be with you. And so suspending judgment will be important. Open and honest sharing is going to be highly important, because in order to make this interactive, I need to hear from you, and making sure that during this presentation, you are one, getting the things that you're looking for, or asking the questions that may help you better understand content that we're discussing today. Respecting one another's thoughts. And for me, there are no wrong questions. So don't worry about asking a question that you may not necessarily know the right way to ask, or are you using the right terminology, or are you going to offend anyone? That's not the purpose of why we're here today. We're here to learn, and we're here to grow together. And so no concern about wrong questions. Nancy will share with you my contact information, and I will you'll hear me say this a couple of times throughout this presentation. I always offer the opportunity, because this is such a crucial topic to discuss, and as it impacts a lot of those of who we serve, the opportunity to contact me outside of this forum. You're welcome to email me, and I even included my phone number. You're welcome to call me, because I don't want folks walking away with questions in any way without having some opportunity to have some answers or some additional conversation. So if there's something that we share and we talk about, and you walk away really feeling like, I just really don't get it, or help me understand, or that's not your experience, or you really want to talk a little bit more, please feel free to reach out to me and email me or give me a call. I'd be happy to have that dialogue and conversation with you. Be supportive of one another, as we all are in a safe space. That is very important in holding these kinds of conversations. Building community amongst each other, two-way conversation. So that means that I'm going to be giving, but I'm also going to be giving you opportunities to share either with me or with us as a group. And so you have the opportunity to do that. And I think that there's an opportunity, even if you want to put a question or something in the Q&A anonymously, I believe, Jamal, we can do that. So I see the head shaking. So if you're more comfortable with that, you're fine as well. And then be a thoughtful listener as well. Be tuned in to hear what your other colleagues across the state, across the country are hearing, asking, listening, and engaging and sharing. And that's important too. And then I wanted to talk specifically about recording of this session and the chat box. And typically when I'm working with other groups, I typically do not record the session. One, because it also supports a room of safety and comfort. and an opportunity to give everyone a chance to be able to share things that may be uncomfortable, that may not necessarily want to have to revisit again. But this session is being recorded because this is being done in a different format than I typically do the work in. So I do want you to know that this is being recorded, and the chat box will be saved, and it will be saved at my request in this forum, because I like to follow up with any questions that if we run out of time, we may not get to answer, or comments that are left in the chat box or in the Q&A, so that you're able to have an opportunity to hear responses to those thoughts that you share. You've taken the time to spend with us today, and I want to give you the opportunity to be heard. So if anyone else doesn't have any other norms that they'd like to have, I'd like to suggest that we go with these norms that are here and creating this safe space, and let's get this going. Marketing, there we go. So collective work, I want to start with this slide to just really talk about the fact that we are all here together and collectively doing the work that serves families in some capacity. And you see the kids in this slide pulling on that rope. And I want to suggest to you that we're all together pulling in the same direction and building teams and working together and doing what's best for families. So I want to welcome you all again. And here we go. So the first thing I want to do is I'm going to ask, Nancy's going to put up a poll, and I would like you to answer this question. And the question is, how are you feeling coming into this community conversation? And let me clarify that. This is not how are you feeling or how is your day going? I mean, as it relates to this topic of crucial conversations about race and disparities and the impact of the pandemic on communities of color, what are your initial feelings about how you're coming into this meeting? And you have an opportunity to choose more than one. So if you're feeling excited and comfortable, you may choose two. Or if you're feeling, if there's not a word there that describes how you're feeling, you're welcome to choose other. So we'll give you a moment or two. Nancy, is there a timeline on it?
No, it's when you're ready.
Okay, I'll give everyone a minute or two to choose. How are you feeling coming into this community conversation? What are the nerves saying? How's your stomach feeling? Are you excited, hopeful? What are you feeling coming into today's conversation? And we'll give it about another 30 seconds or so.
It's starting to slow down.
Slow down. Okay, you can close it, Nancy. Let's take a look. I saw someone put in the chat box they're exhausted. I know the feeling. Most are feeling comfortable. I'm happy to hear that. Hopeful, uncomfortable, worried, anxious, joyful, and fearful. So there is a range of emotions that are in the room, and all of those emotions are natural. I want to honor those who are feeling uncomfortable and worried, and even those who are feeling fearful and anxious, as oftentimes this topic and in different forms and different settings can be tough to engage in conversations. But I want to ask you to lean into this conversation, buckle up and take a ride. This is not going to be a time together where you won't be challenged, but challenged in a meaningful, helpful way with all of us together. But I hope that that level of uncomfortability and anxiousness minimizes. However, I will say though, a healthy dose of uncomfortability is really good, because that also means that there is an awakeness, there's a stirring that's going on, and potentially really ensures that there's some stretching and growing that will occur. So a little bit of uncomfortability is not necessarily a bad at all. So thank you all for taking the time to check in, just so I can see how everyone is thinking or feeling coming into today's session. So one more poll for you really quick to think about. What are your hopes for outcomes of today's session? What are you looking for? And so when Nancy posts that poll, there's going to be a couple of phrases there that you can choose. And I believe it's a multiple choice as well, that you can choose more than one phrase. But what are your hopes coming into today? What are you looking for as takeaways? What are some of the outcomes that you're looking for? Here you go. So take a moment and choose those options. What are your hopes for the outcomes today? And we'll give everyone another moment or two. Nancy, are we slowing down?
Yes, we are.
All right, you may go ahead and close it. And let's see what people are looking for in the ways of hopes and hopeful outcomes. So it's a good mix: purposeful conversations, meaningful lessons learned, gaining some new information. So it's great. So I'm really excited to see that at least thus far, our screen is showing no one hoped not to be moved by our time today. So that's promising. So thank you, Nancy, for sharing those polls. It gives me a sense of understanding of where everyone is and potentially where we can go in this conversation today. Going backwards. There we go. So here's our first group activity that I want to take a walk with you on. And again, I'm going to ask you this time if you would use the chat box and take a look at this picture. And I'm not going to give you much of a hint, but I'm just going to ask you to go to your chat box and give me one or two words that describe what it is you see. One or two words that describe what you see in this picture. And I'll give everyone a minute or two to reflect. So I see diversity, mismatched shoes. I see colorful, I see rainbow. They're all flying by. Inclusion, personality, children, many styles, unity, variety, different, a nation. Oh, I like that one. Future, unity. So yeah, I'm really liking what I'm hearing and what I'm seeing. And I use this picture. You can keep posting those in there if you like. I use this picture because this picture really describes a lot of what we're really going to talk about today. So everything in that circle, they're all shoes, but they're all varying types of shoes, different lengths, different. Some have heels, some are thongs, some have strings, some have open toes, and then I didn't notice if anyone even indicated that the ground those shoes are on. Did anyone talk about the rocks that are underneath and what that would indicate in the process as well? So thank you all for taking the time to do that and think about what you see in the screen as we begin to have this thought-provoking conversation, and we sometimes challenge some of our core beliefs and our norms. Mark, can you shift me, please? It's not shifting. Thank you. So we're going to define some terms. And I mentioned that earlier, we're going to talk about some terms. And I think there are 3 terms that we're going to define for you today. We're going to define systemic racism, equity and equality, and conscious and unconscious bias. Go ahead, Mark. Thank you. So most of us who serve in some capacity for an organization, a company, and some work capacity typically have that general list of trainings that we have to really take on a yearly basis. And Over the decades, this term of CLC or cultural competency has been changed. Pick a decade, it shifts along the decade. So you may be comfortable with hearing cultural competence, culturally responsive, cultural humility, DEI, and including DEI and J, which includes justice. So those are just some of the very broad terms that are used as an overview for the larger kinds of conversations that really are had. So across the decades, those terminologies have changed over time. Slide, please. Thank you. So how do we define equity? And you'll see with this picture here, which most of us have probably seen in some capacity or another with different pictures. But on the left-hand side, you see a picture of equality. On the right-hand side, you see a picture of equity. And on the picture on the left with equality, you see that in various genders, you see boys and girls, but you notice that they're all standing on two books. And so they are equally on a level playing field. They both have, all three of them have the same amount of books. So therefore they should be good, right? That's what equality says. And I know for the last 60 or 70 years, we have as a society really focused on creating, building, maintaining equality and ensuring that every person has equal access to everything. And that's important. It's a start. It's the basis of where we start to ensure that everyone has the ability to access things in life in general. And we all have that right to do that by virtue of just being born. But if you look to the right, equity says, on the other hand, you have the same three individuals and you notice all of their books, they have different numbers of books underneath them based on their need. Slide, please, Mark. So based on their need, equality and equity has a clear difference. Equality says each person gets the same amount of everything, no matter how much you may need, how little you may need, everything is equal. Everybody gets the same amount. Equity says each person gets exactly what they need with no reflection on others. So, for example, if we take those three individuals in that picture and I have a pie with 12 slices, equality would say that everyone would get 4 slices of pizza. And that's great that everyone has an equal amount of pizza. But equity says, what if one of you only needed 2 slices of pizza and you were full? What if one of you needed 5 slices of pizza? So equity says that the person should get exactly what it is that they need. So let me put that in terms of the work that we do. So if we're providing a service, let's say a therapeutic service, and the insurance company says that you have 10 therapy sessions that you can access during the course of a calendar year. Well, equality says everybody gets offered 10, everybody can take their 10 and be happy. But equity says, well, what if I need 15? Equity says I should be able to access 15. Equity says if there are 10 being offered and I only need 2, I don't have to take all 10. So it really is about balancing equality and equity and understanding that there is a difference between both, and we are at a stage of equality, and in some cases equity is being met in some areas, but we are continuing to move toward a more equitable way of doing things so that each person is really getting exactly what it is that they need. Slide, please, Mark. So unconscious and conscious bias, and this is a term that you've probably heard many different times in many different ways. And so conscious and unconscious bias is something that everyone holds, everyone possesses. You can't avoid it. It naturally happens based on our own environments and our traditions and values, where we were born, what part of the country. All of those things affect and impact the way in which we build and or create bias. So bias is social stereotypes about certain groups of people that individuals form outside their own conscious awareness. And again, recognizing that everyone holds these beliefs, it's usually based around various social and identity groups, and these biases stem from one's tendency to organize social worlds by categorizing. And so we really, unintentionally, in a lot of cases, just group people together because it's easy for our minds to wrap around everything that we may see and we may encompass. So I'm going to ask Mark, I have a quick video, a 4-minute video that I want to share that's just sort of going to give you a really brief overview of unconscious bias in a way that you can recognize unconscious bias in yourself, and a way that you can begin to sort of check yourself or remind yourself about this unconscious bias. So Mark, if you would go ahead and play the video, please.
Take a look at this image. How many triangles do you see? 2, 6, maybe even 8? Ready for the answer? Well, actually, it's 0. There are no triangles. On average, our brains are working hard to try and process 11 million pieces of information every second. In reality, they consciously only capture about 50 pieces per second and actually process just 7, meaning we're constantly taking shortcuts to fill in the blanks. Unconscious bias is an example of a shortcut our brain takes to make snap judgments about people before we even realize we've done so. Everyone has deep subconscious preferences for people with similar characteristics to ourselves. Things like our own background, personal experiences, societal stereotypes, and cultural context all influence the perception we have of another person before we even get to know them. These biases can actually have harmful effects. They can prevent organisations from achieving diversity, as well as create barriers in people's careers. For example, research done by ActionAid and Care International found that female surge staff, that's the staff deployed in an emergency humanitarian response, felt agencies automatically turn to males to take up leadership positions, even if they're less qualified than their female counterparts. So, how can you tackle the influence of unconscious bias? Step 1. Become aware. There are dozens of different types of bias. Let's take a look at 3 common ones. Like me bias is when you have bias towards someone who looks like you or has a similar background as you. Confirmation bias is when we only listen to information that confirms our preconceptions. And anchor bias is when your mind anchors to the first piece of information that you were given about a subject. Anchor bias can particularly affect salary negotiations, and one example of this in the global development sector is the USAID biodata form.
Essentially, you have to write down your salary history for the last 3 years. And so if you are sending your biodata to a recruiter, the moment they open it and they look at your salary history, it's essentially them anchoring to that information. And from kind of that point on, regardless of if it's a much higher position, if it's a much riskier position, if it's a much more technical position, it almost doesn't matter because the recruiter's mind has anchored to this information that you've provided to them.
Becoming aware of your unconscious bias can often be the hardest step. The first thing to do is look back at when you've made decisions at work that might have been influenced by your unconscious bias. Think about the particular situation you were in when you made the decision and how the decision-making could be improved if you were more aware of your bias. Step 2. Find your trigger. Write a list of situations when you are most likely to experience these unconscious biases. Is it in meetings or before a particularly tough decision? Does it happen over email or when you talk to a specific group or person? Maybe it's when you're in certain moods, like when you're hungry, stressed, or tired. Step 3. Slow down. Next time you notice a trigger, try giving yourself a minute to pause and consider your response before instantly reacting.
So a great way to turn off that older part of your brain that makes these automatic snap judgments is simply to take 3 deep breaths. And you want to take, full breaths. So breathe in, then breathe out, and then count. And that helps you to calm down and turn off that fight or flight part of your brain and get back to the more normal part of your brain that can make a more rational decision.
Step 4. Do one small thing differently. You could ask a different person to kick off each meeting, or after a meeting, ask for feedback from someone who wasn't vocal and seriously consider their opinion. Once you've implemented this action, take note and give yourself some deserved recognition for tackling your unconscious bias. Research shows that positive emotions help to cement things as habits. Now you know what unconscious bias is Maybe you can think of a time when it affected a decision you've made, or perhaps you've experienced the consequences of someone else's bias. Let us know your thoughts by commenting on the video, and you can look back at all the content we produced for the Global Dev Women campaign on devx.com.
So as you think about conscious and unconscious bias and how or the role that can play in your daily life, also affects the way in which we potentially do the work that we do with families as well. So the biases that one carries or one develops over time is pretty important. And so she shared a couple of ways that we can take a look at recognizing those things and making small changes over time so that our biases, the work that we do, isn't led by a particular bias that we may have about what we're doing, whether it's families or about a service or what have you. Just understanding that there is power behind that bias that we all carry, even though it is unconscious in some cases. And so we do have the power to work on that and bring about some change, some positive change. And then lastly, let's talk a little bit about systemic racism. And there's a pretty long definition here with a couple of examples. And basically, systemic racism is really based around power, structures, and wealth. And it's about imbalance and inequality. It's about systems in place that create and maintain racial inequality in nearly every facet of our life. And you think about this definition that the director of NAACP ACP has is systems and structures that have procedures or processes that disadvantage African Americans, and this can be any group of color. And Wikipedia defines it as the formalization of a set of institutional, historical, cultural, and interpersonal practices within a society that are more often than not puts one social or ethnic group in a better position to succeed, and at the same time disadvantages other groups in a consistent and constant, and those are key words, consistent and constant manner that disparities develop between the groups over a period of time. And so it's important to think about the way in which our society is framed. That we're framed by systems, by laws and policies and regulations, and by organizations and by structures. And so all of those things have ways in which work happens, ways in which business happens, ways in which we are to function and move within those boundaries. And when some of those things are set up to benefit one group of folks and to exclude other groups of folks, that is where you find the line of racism. And then we have one more quick video to share with you. And Mark, if you would share the video that talks about.
This is Jamal. Jamal is a boy who lives in a poor neighborhood. He has a friend named Kevin who lives in a wealthy neighborhood. All of Jamal's neighbors are African American, and all of Kevin's neighbors are white. Because Jamal's school district is mostly funded by property taxes, his school is not very well funded. His classrooms are overcrowded, his teachers are underpaid, and he doesn't have access to high-quality tutors or extracurricular activities. Kevin's school district is also funded by property taxes, so his school is very well funded. His classrooms are never crowded, his teachers are very well paid, and he has access to high-quality tutors and lots of extracurricular activities. Kevin and Jamal live only a few streets away from each other. So how come they're growing up in such different worlds with such different opportunities for success? The answer has to do with America's history of systemic racism. To understand it better, let's look at what life was like for Kevin and Jamal's grandparents. Decades after the Civil War, many government agencies started to draw maps dividing cities into sections that were either desirable or undesirable for investment. This practice was called redlining, and it usually blocked off entire black neighborhoods from access to private and public investment. Banks and insurance companies used these maps for decades to deny black people loans and other services based purely on race. Historically speaking, owning a home and getting a college education is the easiest way for an American family to build wealth. But when Jamal's grandparents wanted to buy a house, the banks refused because they lived in a neighborhood that was redlined. So Jamal's grandparents were not able to buy a home, and because colleges could prevent them from attending through legal segregation, their options for higher education were really scarce. Kevin's grandparents, on the other hand, got a low-interest loan to buy their first house and got accepted into a handful of top universities, which traditionally only accepted white students. This opened up a wealth of opportunities that they were able to pass on to their kids and grandkids. Even as late as the 1980s, an investigation into the Atlanta real estate market showed that banks were more willing to lend to low-income white families than to middle or upper-income African-American families. As a result, today, for every $100 of wealth held by a white family, Black families have $5.04. A 2017 study confirms that redlining is still affecting home values in major cities like Chicago today. This explains how Kevin and Jamal inherited vastly different circumstances. Unfortunately, the story doesn't end there. A big part of systemic racism is implicit bias. These are prejudices in society that people are not aware that they have. Let's go back to Kevin and Jamal. Against all odds, Jamal manages to be the only student from his high school to get accepted into a great university, the same one that Kevin and his high school friends are attending. But after Kevin and Jamal both graduate, Jamal notices that his resume isn't drawing as much interest as Kevin's, even though they graduated from the same program with the exact same GPA. Unfortunately for Jamal, studies show that resumes with white-sounding names get twice as many callbacks as identical resumes with black-sounding names. Implicit bias is one of the reasons why the Black unemployment rate is twice the rate of white unemployment, even among college graduates today. You can see evidence of systemic racism in every area of life. The disparities in family wealth, incarceration rates, political representation, and education are all examples of systemic racism. Unfortunately, the biggest challenge with systemic racism is that there's no single person or entity responsible for it, which makes it very hard to solve. So what can you do? The first thing you can do is work towards becoming more aware of your own implicit biases. What are some prejudices that you might hold that you're not aware of? Second, let's acknowledge that the consequences of slavery and Jim Crow laws are still affecting access to opportunity today. As a result, we should support systemic changes that create more equal opportunities for everyone. Increasing public school funding and making it independent from property taxes would be a great start, so that poor and wealthy districts can receive equal access to resources. Systemic problems require systemic solutions. Luckily, we're all part of the system, which means that we all have a role to play in making it better. Peace.
So as you can see, understanding the root cause of systemic racism it's multifaceted, and as indicated, it doesn't sit in one place, and it isn't one person, and it isn't one group. And so it is a systemic issue across all entities that that over time has been built in, or oftentimes you will hear it's baked in the process. And so understanding what we need to do takes all of us. It isn't something that one person can really do. It takes all of us to first have these crucial conversations, gain understanding so that we can make effective and meaningful decisions moving forward that hopefully serve all in a more equitable way. And then culture. And what does culture mean? And as we think about culture, and you see on the word cloud here, there are tons of words that are there that really describe culture. And culture really isn't about any one person's particular color, but culture is really about an environment, a collective. So there are cultures in the work environment. So there's a culture that belongs to your office. There's a culture that belongs to your group of friends. Our kids have a culture that's amongst their group of friends. So all kinds of entities have culture associated to it, and what's the norm, what's the typical standard that goes along with the culture. And so as we think about culture, and we'll come back to this a little bit, but I wanted to interject this here as we begin to think about what these terms really mean and how does it work and look and move and breathe among the systems in which we work. Slide, please. So as I mentioned earlier, when I do this work and we really get into having more in-depth crucial conversations, it's really done in 3 different phases, and we won't have the opportunity to get really deep in our time together today with all three phases, but I really want to highlight to you what those three phases really are. And so those three phases or pieces are self-assessing, organizational, and policies, procedures, laws, regulations, and assessment tools. And that seems like a lot, and it is. So let's break down each piece just really briefly. Next slide, please. So the self-assessing piece is really thinking about spending time understanding who you are when you show up in a room, how you show up in a room, what you bring with you when you show up in the room. And I don't mean literally bring, but I mean who you are. Thinking about your personal experiences. How does what you do or the life you live really impact those in whom you serve? And how do your life experiences impact you and your work role and you serving families? Because please know that who you are, your life experiences, your traditions, your values, your expectations, your trauma, your experiences, all that you are enters the room while we serve families. And there is power in that because we have the ability to influence one way or another those in whom we serve. And so as we think about who you are, we have to ask ourselves some really important questions around this thing called equity, around this thing called disparity, around this thing called race, and really understanding who you are as an individual, how you move about in this world amongst your families, how you move amongst your workforce, and how you move in serving families. And so you have to spend some time there. And typically, based on the work that's being done with a group or an organization, we spend several months sitting in this place, really just talking about who we are and breaking it down and understanding more than just what you look like from the physical surface and what makes you up. You really have to think about your traditions and your values, your family structures. You have to consider where you were born in this country, if you were born in this country, what part of the country, then where you went to school, whether you grew up in an urban environment, a suburban environment, a rural environment. All of those pieces have affected who you are today. And so doing some self-reflecting and really considering how you show up in a room and the power you bring with you showing up in the room is really important and has the ability to affect families. Next slide, please. Organizationally, thinking about where you work and your organization and your group and your office and the team you may specifically work with and the families you work with. So what is the culture of your organization? What are the things that go on in your organization on a regular basis? What are the unspoken rules in the office? And unspoken rules, I'm referring to those things that go on in the office that those who would work in that organization or in that office building just have a clear understanding because that's where they work. Someone walking in off the street would not necessarily know some of those norms and those unspoken rules that occur within an office. So there's some unspoken rules that go on there. How inclusive are things for families in that work environment? Are families considered in that process of that the work that you do? How do you make decisions for families? How do you play a part in making decisions for families, whether you are a direct service person or not? Even if you are in a managerial position, you still are making decisions for families and on behalf of them. What about our service providers? How are they functioning and what are they doing and how do they impact those in who they serve? And then you think about the whole child, and I'll venture to say, this is my personal opinion, and I will preface that by saying that a lot of the work that we do really is reflective of that concept of whole child or the whole person. And I think that is a best practice and is something that we work towards. But in this line of work, when I talk about racial equity and disparities, I really consider asking the question if we really do serve the whole child. And I say that from the lens of being inclusive of who someone is, all that they are when they show up in a room. And a lot of the services and things that we may offer to individuals and to families are really driven by the policies and the procedures and the plans and those things that make everything tick, which has to be there. But oftentimes it excludes the ability to recognize that families are different and that families may have different needs, and we may have some additional needs. And do we have the capacity within this particular service to be able to address that whole family, meaning considering who they are in its entirety and not just that they have this diagnosis or they have this need or they have this deficit. Are we really serving the whole child? And oftentimes it's a question we really need to think twice about. Next slide, please. And then lastly, we're taking a look at assessment tools and other forms of data. And I say this specifically because oftentimes all of the work that we do, again, is driven by policies and regulations and service plans and expectations and referrals and all of these things along the way. And oftentimes we're doing assessments to determine what the needs are. So the question is, what information are you really seeking? When we're asking these questions of individuals and families, what are we really trying to get at? Are we really trying to determine what need a particular person really has, or are we trying to determine what other deficits or what other categories or what other isms that we can identify based on how someone responds to a question? Really thinking about how those questions are designed. Are they culturally sensitive? And I'll use the example here when you think about the education world, because all of our kids in Pennsylvania take the PSSA, and I'm sure those of us from other parts of the country have other testing that occurs as well, that every student has to take no matter what. And so we take the PSSA, and being culturally sensitive says that when those questions are being designed, because everyone's taking the same test, it's not mindful of various environments. So for example, I recall when, and this is going back some time, but it's a simple example to understand this process of when one of my boys was in first grade and taking one of the, he wasn't taking the PSSA, but he was taking a benchmark test. And when you look at the question, I currently reside in an urban environment, but I grew up in a rural environment on a farm. And so one of the questions that was asked of the first graders, it was a multiple choice, and it was just a picture of a kid playing in front of the house with some grass and a couple animals around, and they were supposed to choose the mailbox. And so for urban children are going to, if you ask them to find the mailbox in that picture with a house and someone playing out front, they're going to pick the letter that has the mailbox on the door, because in urban environments, that's where your mailbox is. Your mailbox is either on the door or right next to your wall. But where I grew up in the country on a farm, my mailbox was at the end of a half-mile driveway. So I'm going to pick a different box. Well, that question really isn't reflective of someone's intellect. It is reflective of environmental. So wherever someone grew up, that was a question that was indicative of where someone grew up. So why should a child in an urban environment get that question wrong when the answer they were looking for was going to be the other letter with the mailbox at the end of the driveway? But that's not that child's experience. So that's not really balanced or based on one's knowledge, it's based on one's experience. So that's just a quick example of being culturally sensitive when we are developing and designing these things. So what are we leaving out or excluding in the questions that we ask? What types of questions are we really asking? And what are we trying to get to in that process of assessing individuals and families? And have we really considered that we need to take the time to step back to really think about, well, what really is this question trying to garner, and what really is that question getting to? So having those thoughtful conversations about developing goals and plans and outcomes, and doing referrals, and making sure that we're identifying the right thing so we don't further stigmatize or categorize folks, and are we really looking to expand that at-risk group, which typically is what happens with some of these types of assessments. Next slide, please, Mark.
Lisa, I see this conversation in the chat, and it's
Okay.
catching my attention about people feeling they are forced into a mold, feeling helpless. And there was one suggestion of just taking life one day at a time. I'm wondering if that was something you wanted to address.
Yes, the being forced into the mold, because we are really driven as a society. We're driven by, boundaries, laws, expectations, policies, regulations, and those are natural to maintain a sense of order in the way in which we do things. But that doesn't mean that in the development of policies, laws, assessments, regulations, all of those guiding tools that we use, that we can't be reflective of everyone that we serve. And a lot of times when we think about developing policies and procedures, we're thinking about, one, how does it best serve those in the workforce? Or how does it best serve or drive, in some cases, maybe specifically the funding stream that the work is being done in? It's not really being designed to say, well, I've got this group of families that has this specific need. What do they really need? And building something to meet that need. But it is more about those policies and regulations and the guidelines saying you must do A, B, and C, when really we have many families that need C, D, and E. So it's about looking at our policies and procedures. And I'm not saying we need to blow everything up, but what I am saying is that it would behoove us to take some time to look at our policies and procedures and be intentional about it, but also be thoughtful about how we can either change, create, develop, without reinventing the wheel. Because if it's working somewhere else, why can't we duplicate it? So taking a look at something, because we do tend to follow molds because the plan is already set, the design is already there, the directions, the policies, the procedures are already laid out for us, and then we as the providers or the staff, we come in and we just execute. And sometimes in our execution, it is really more about the specific service or the delivery of whatever it is that we're referring to, versus does this really meet all of the needs of an individual or a family? So if we think about it from that lens, it's being thoughtful about, do I need to make adjustments for this particular family? And we're going to talk about it a little later on. But I'm going to give the example now, and just really thinking about like the way in which our policies and procedures are done. They're designed to serve, and this is just going to be an analogy, like all of our families are squares. So our policies and procedures are designed to serve the squares families. But what about when that triangle family comes along? Or what about when that octagon family comes along? We expect that triangle and the octagon family to fit into this square, which isn't going to happen. But instead of making adjustments or being able to look at that whole family of that triangle or that octagon, we either say they had a failed or discharge, or they exit the program because they were unsuccessful. But everything about that says that if we would have taken an opportunity to serve that whole child, because this family is triangle, that triangle is never going to fit into that box. So why is it that we can't go back to the drawing board and take a look at what specifically may be needed to be able to serve this triangle family or this octagon family, when everything that we've designed based on the way it has been designed is designed to serve a square family? All families are not the same. All families they look the same, but all families don't all have the same needs. They don't have all the same strengths. And therefore, we must really begin to have those more intense conversations around how do we really address the whole family needs, and being able to sort of model and shape what we need to be able to serve that particular family. So I see there's a lot going on in the chat, Nancy, but I hope that answers that individual's question.
Lisa, I think it's certainly did, but I think it's brought up another issue here that I know the time is 3:32, but I just
Oh,
feel
is it
we should-
already? Sheesh.
Yeah, and I just feel that we want to address this, which is you're speaking to us from a position of power and authority. You have power and authority. And some of the people on this webinar today do too, but most people don't. And their question is, what can they do to fix this? Now, I don't expect you to answer that question right now, but I think it's important that we realize that that question is out there. And maybe that's something you can address at another time, but just to let you know that that question is out there. And I won't ask you any
Make a
more
note of
questions.
it. I really want to answer that, but I know it's going to take us down another pass, and there are several more slides to go and conversations I really want to get into. So I'm not ignoring the question, and it's really driving me crazy that I can't look at the chat box to see what's going on in the chat to engage with it. So, but I'm really excited that you are having those conversations in the chat box, and I'm looking forward to hearing when we have that opportunity and being able to read what everyone says. So I'm going to push forward a little bit, and then we'll have an opportunity to have a little bit more dialogue. So this slide here talking about the human service world versus reality. And I put this in here because I've often had this conversation with individuals about the world of human services, no matter what system we're in. And I've often seen it no matter where I am across the country, where when we talk about access and we think about opportunities and we think about the systems that we work within. And I noticed some years ago when I started making this comment to colleagues and friends along the way, when we would be at conferences or different things like that, and they would have beautiful advertising and marketing materials and a very wide representation of cultures and ethnicities and races, and beautifully done work in all of the posters and all of those things at the function. But I noticed that when it was connected to something related to mental health, we did a really, really good job of making sure that the people in those pictures were very reflective of all colors. There were a lot of people of color in all of those pictures in the advertising that goes on when it connects to something related to mental health. But in our typical everyday society, when it comes to advertising, whether it's social media, TV, print materials, commercials, what have you, color is not that present. They're better at it now, but color is not very as valued or seen as it is that I noticed over the years within the mental health system. And that sets up a way in which that unconscious bias can come into play, because it gives the perception that if every time I go somewhere and we see advertising that connects in some shape, form, or fashion to something mental health, and mostly all the pictures are of color, the implication is most of the people being served in these systems are some form of color. But that is not what we see out in typical society on TV and commercials and the like. And so when you think about the way in which messages are sent, that's one message that oftentimes gets overlooked and missed. And so because I've had that conversation a number of times with folks, I wanted to share that with you and just put that on your radar and begin to pay attention to the way in which messages are being sent and being built and informed for others. Next slide, Mark, please. So let's get into a little bit of the data. For sake of time, I've got a good bit of data, and I think I saw someone ask earlier about slides, and I assume Nancy will address that at the end, but the slides will be, I don't mind the slides being shared so that you have the data that's going to be shared today, because it's a lot and we're not going to be able to get into every bit of it, but I do want to highlight a couple of things for you. So let's talk a little bit about the data as it relates to the pandemic. Mark, slide, please. So very briefly here, I just want to highlight a couple of things as it relates to the pandemic. African-American people were 13% of our population, but we were 1 in 3 hospitalized and 3.7 times more likely to succumb to death than whites as it relates to at the height of the pandemic. Quarantining could have been a challenge for a lot of people of color because primarily they hold service jobs and were unable to stay at home in quarantine because most of those types of service jobs are considered essential workers, and things such as living conditions. A lot of people of color reside in cities, therefore you have closer color quarters, and also there's multi-generational living that occurs as well within communities of color. And then there's a piece with a lack of health insurance. Next slide, and I'm breezing through because our time is running out. This is some data specifically from SAMHSA, which reflects a little bit of what we talked about in the last slide, but also just really highlighted the importance of living conditions and the housing conditions and the impact of communities of color, particularly in major cities where they're using public transportation to get around, and the impact of not being able to quarantine because 1, they're in those service jobs, but 2, they're traveling on public transportation in very tight and close quarters. And then next slide, Mark. Again, taking a look at the impact with mental health on Blacks from COVID. So I'm just going to highlight a couple of things here because I want to get to the last section and just spend a minute or two there. So child abuse reports and death of Black children were on the rise during COVID. Black youth facing rising rates in depression, anxiety, and suicide. And this is an area where sometimes there either are some myths around or misconceptions about children of color, specifically when it comes to depression, anxiety, and suicide. And suicide is on the rise. I don't have that specific, I can share that with Nancy, so it goes to everyone with the presentation, but I do have the specific data around the suicide rate, the increased suicide rates for African-American children, and it's quite alarming during this course of time as well. Emotional impact of families unable to properly honor their losses, so not being able to properly celebrate life. And that was certainly not just for people of color, that was for everyone at the height of the pandemic, not being able to really come together and honor and celebrate the loss of life. And then crises amongst families coping with pre-COVID struggles and now adding the burden. So just thinking about the challenges of housing, food insecurity, poverty, all of these things that were issues for families before COVID were now really heightened due to COVID. And there's a saying amongst communities of color that goes that when white communities catch a cold, Black communities or communities of color catch pneumonia. And what that means is typically that there are struggles that are amongst communities of color that are just innate due to being of different background, whether that be, Hispanic, Black, whatever it is, a community of color. There are some challenges that are just innately belonging to communities of color that really have nothing to do with COVID. But then when you add COVID to the mix and the deficits that created for everyone over these years, it has just exacerbated the needs amongst communities of color. Next slide, Mark, please. What I really want to get to share with you in the way of data is taking a look at over the years. There are pieces of data that I collect from families that I work with. And one of the areas I really focused on was really wanting to hear from families, what families think that we, the systems, think about them. And then also what families want systems to really honestly know about them. So next slide, please, Mark. I want to highlight for you, and you may or may not be able to see this, and it's a lot of information here. It actually isn't all of it. I just took some and put into a slide. So if you think about the system of special education, this is the mental health system, foster care system, and then the system of families, just families in general. So the words and phrases you see here on the screen are all things that families have said that they think that systems think about them. So those who work in any one of these systems or across systems, this is what families think that you think about them based on their experiences moving through the systems. Some of those things are not so nice. This is how they see or feel that systems believe and feel about them. So if you see in special education, it says labeled, segregated, problem kids, need to control their kids, in it for the money. And I think that's related to individuals and or a school district, needy and dumb. And it goes across the lens. If you look at what the mental health system says, it says they, meaning providers, can't fix us. They think that your goal is to fix them. And so there's some challenges here. Mental illness is a choice. They feel like that they're treated as such that the system thinks that they're choosing to have a mental health. Families should know who and where to go. And we won't go over all of these, but it's some very interesting data that families have said about our systems. Now, Mark, could you go to the next slide, please? And the next two slides, and we won't hit those two slides because our time is coming short, but these are the things that I see the question, someone asking where the data came from. This data is specifically asked of families who are in the systems, the families who are moving through the systems that I have worked with over the years. This is the information that they have shared about how systems think about them. And so here's what one slide about what systems want us to know about them as families is they're just people like everyone else. They have opinions and a request and want to be heard and listened to. They want the best for their families, help people find more education and better jobs. They want open and honest two-way communication. All children should be able to have choices in their care, mental health care, and so on, and listen to them. And there's another slide, and we don't have time to go through it, but it's very powerful information that I've continued to collect over the years, because we can't make anything better if we aren't asking those whom we serve. It's great that we evaluate ourselves that work within the systems, and we want to improve the way in which we do our business, and we collect our data in our paperwork. But the true value of the effectiveness of the work that we do really comes from how our families see us moving and progressing. And if they are finding their needs being met, and if their family members are receiving the care in which they feel that they need at that particular time. Next slide, Mark. Can you jump 2 slides? Because we're not going to be able to hit that data. So access and inclusion, and I talked a little earlier about access. and really thinking about access. But I'm going to give you another way to really look at this. And again, it goes back to one of those initial questions where you were answering one of the poll, the one question about what you saw in the picture of the shoes and the rocks. So access versus inclusion, and how do we define access? And I was going to do an activity with this, but we don't have time right now. So can you go to the next slide, Mark? So access versus inclusion, and what I want to identify here is, what is the difference? What is the difference between access and inclusion? And we all think that we know what access is, and we probably do. And we all think we know what inclusion is, and we probably do. But access, by example, is being invited to the party. So if you think about, going to a party or getting the invitation to a party, everybody may get the invitation. But inclusion says when you get to the party, are you asked to dance? So it really is really thinking about that. And so my saying is access ain't inclusion. And we think about education again as an example. Everybody has access to education. Every child has access to education. But your quality education is based on your zip code. And so what you have access to then becomes either limited, it could become watered down, it could become old information because it's based on your zip code or based on your tax base. So when you think about access, we all have access to education, but the quality of that education is debatable. So again, that therein lies, we may not be quite at inclusion. Some would say we are, because everyone has that access to information, but we may have access to information. Just like we in the state of Pennsylvania, we are a resource-rich state. But if you don't have an awareness of where to go and what to do, all the resources in the world aren't helpful to you. So you have access, but you're not included. So understanding that, or if we think about our human service system and how we really do referrals. And I gave this example around the square and the triangle family, and how we try to make and oftentimes force. And again, I'm saying that again from personal experience with my children, how we try to force families into situations, or they have to, what I call, fail up to the service that they need, because we can't provide them. We may know that they need service D, but because of the way we do our insurance practices or the way we do our referral practices, they have to fail A, B, and C before they can get to D, when we really know they need a D to begin with. So what is that really saying about how we do things? So access and inclusion, and understanding the difference between the two and the way in which we do those things. Next slide, please. So this is a concept that I wanted to share, and I haven't really begun to share this until probably in the last year or two, when it came up in a previous presentation, where we talked about cultural considerations. And what I mean by cultural considerations is thinking about how we as American society function in this mental health system, or the human service systems as we think about it. So in our dominant culture in American society, when we think about mental health, we think about it from the intellectual lens, what we have to do to fix what's going on up here, whatever the issue or the diagnosis or the challenge may be. And in African American cultures and other cultures of color, when you have someone that has a mental health diagnosis or considered special or unique, it is really looks more upon as a spiritual way to address it. Very much looking at that person's heart and soul. And so there's a difference in the way in which communities of color and our dominant culture in American society process through and look at the ways in which we engage this thing called mental health. And so that, I say all that to say that therein lies sometimes some of the stigma amongst communities of color, that access or challenge you with not accessing the services that may be made available to a family, because most of the work that's being done amongst communities of color in our history has really been about taking care of our own, and through spirituality and prayer and caring for them and keeping them home and providing their care at home versus going outside of the home care and services. There are cultural differences there. And so sometimes that's where some of the stigma aligns in the work that's being done too. So understanding the way in which communities of color look at some of the needs can also affect that as well. Next slide, please. And as we begin to wrap up with not a ton of time, and I will, if Mark, Nancy, and Jamal don't mind, I'd be happy to take a few questions, but I want to leave you with this brief phrase here that I put together that I wanted to share with you. And if you just listen to the words that I'm going to say and think about all that we've discussed this afternoon, and hopefully this hits you the way in which my heart's desire is for it to hit you. We are all beautifully broken, and we're each carrying just one piece of the total masterpiece. The masterpiece is never completed until we all figure out how to connect our broken pieces. I see a typo, I'm sorry. The final puzzle depends not only on me, but it requires you as well. Therefore, I'm asking, what piece of the puzzle are you hoarding? Think about the work you must do personally to move the needle forward. So as we think about our time together today, Jamal, I will take questions or comments if anyone has those questions. There's a lot going on in the chat box and I can't really catch it all, but with everyone's permission, I would like to be able to go through the chat box after our session, and I'll happily take some questions and comments. And there's my contact information that you're welcome to reach out to continue conversations. Jamal, questions?
Thank you, Lisa. There was a lot in the chat, but we did have a couple of questions in the Q&A that I'll ask you. Robert wants to know, when it comes to presentations such as this, he often hears repeatedly that we have to have conversations about ... I appreciate the need to have such conversations, though I rarely ever hear them happening. What does it look like to have these conversations, and where are they happening? In your estimation, Lisa, where?
Well, I will say, and thank you for the question, Robert. I will answer the question this way. I've been having, or I've been leading and facilitating diversity trainings. Again, think about all those terms from decades ago, for about 25 years. I will honestly say to you, it was the shift in my work, or my request for my work, took place after the murder of George Floyd. And the recognition that everybody was having, or the desire was to have these conversations. Now, I will be the first to tell you, every person of color cannot lead these kinds of conversations. It is a passion of mine personally, because I've been through some stuff in this color skin, and I haven't shared any of those stories, but I've been through some things in my 55 years. But we can't have forward progress if those conversations aren't had. So the benefit to me walking around bitter and angry and hating those who don't look like me makes no sense to me. It's not productive. It's not emotionally healthy. It's not physically healthy. And most importantly, it's not changing anything. And so in this work over the years, and since the George Floyd occurred, And the opportunity present itself for folks to start to say that we need to start to look at disparities, and we need to take it seriously, and we need to start to have the conversations. And so the couple of things that I would say to you is kudos for organizations and groups and individuals recognizing those conversations need to happen. But if you earnestly want to make forward progress in those conversations, when you come to the table, it has to be a safe space. It has to be a place where all voices are heard, but it has to be a place where it's done, where there's some level playing field, in that there's some base understanding about terminology, like we set the stage today. And there's some things we got to own. And in doing so, then you have to ask yourself if you really want to have the conversation without pointing the fingers. We've been doing that all our lives. Pointing the fingers has not gotten us anywhere, and nothing's changed. And the reason why in those 3 phases I talked about, that usually in this DEI work, we come together as an organization and we talk about what we need to do as an organization. And I've just said that when it comes to crucial conversations about race, I will no longer start the conversation at the organizational level because people make up the organization, and we need to deal with the people, which means we need to deal with the individuals and the self. So we have to start there with who you are and how you show up in the room. And sometimes that means getting a little uncomfortable to have those conversations. And that's kind of where you start. And I'd be happy to talk more with you offline about that as well, and how you go about creating those safe spaces. But you have to know who the people are that are coming together to have the conversations, because everybody's not ready. Everyone's not ready, and you have to be okay with people who want to remain quiet, who I've done these sessions where people have gotten angry, where people have cried, where people have said, I didn't know any of this stuff, where, so it's a world of outcomes that can occur. But if you want to start the conversations, you have to be honest, and it has to be a safe place.
Thank you, Lisa.
You're welcome.
And our last question is from Yolanda. She says, many people don't care, but others are not aware of how discrimination, lack of inclusion, segregation, and oppression can impact minorities. How can we educate the rest of the population about this impact?
It's a great question, Yolanda. And it really goes back to what I said about every person of color can't lead these conversations, because in part she just named it. And in some of the sessions that I do with other groups, when we were unpacking the 3 phases, we talk about those specific pieces, and we talk about the impact to communities of color, and the impact specifically in this case to African Americans, because of the history of African Americans in our country. And through my years of research, where it shows the genetic stain on the DNA of African American people by virtue of just being born in this color skin. And then knowing your heritage, because there are challenges to that. There are a lot of people, Black people, who don't know, by virtue of our history in this country, who don't know their legacy. They don't know their lineage. So therefore, there isn't a legacy. There isn't, I just lost the word. There isn't a
Legacy?
No, not legacy. Inheritance. There isn't an inheritance, and there isn't all of these pieces because you don't have that connection. And so there are pieces, and I'm trying to say this without using the word burden, but there is a weight that is, thank you, Kyra, lineage. There is a weight that is often carried And in many conversations I've had with others along the way, you know, when we have the opportunity to dig deeper into each one of these phases, and you know, they've said, I don't even understand sometimes how you get up, because when everything is so designed for you not to be successful, when you're fighting against the vein all the time, it is really definitely a challenge. And I saw, I believe it's Gabrielle talking about in the chat box, intergenerational trauma, and it is, again, because it's on the DNA. And so understanding that, giving people space and place, and when they're ready to have those conversations, because I embrace this work. I love talking about this stuff. So I'll talk about it anytime, day or night, any place. But I also know that there are other people of color who just aren't there. And so having those conversations aren't as easy. And oftentimes if our, but it's important for me to say that I really not only want people of color to understand, of course, their own personal journey and their impact, but we have to have these collective conversations with our white counterparts. We have to be able to sit down and have those conversations without judgment, without hatred, without any of those things, because everybody has a history. We all have a history, known or unknown. We all have a history. But we can't grow if we can't sit down and talk about appropriately what our experiences are and understand how these things do get passed on. So, you know, your own personal family structure, your traditions and values, those things just get passed on to the next generation. And so when you start to have some of these kinds of conversations, why it gets uncomfortable is because you're norming and storming on the inside and potentially challenging some thoughts or feelings that a grandparent may have taught you, or not even taught you, something that you may have seen when you were a child. It's beginning to challenge those kind of things. So just having the conversation so that we can learn from one another is really, really important. And starting with self is the only way we're going to, in my opinion, be able to do this work to really effectively change things, bringing it back to our field of work, change systems in the way in which we do things. Otherwise, 20 years from now, we're going to be having the same conversation, and we're going to be talking about the disparity in services and why in a lot of our services, children of color are overrepresented. You know, so you have to ask yourself if you really want to make the change. And that's the question that I ask when I'm approached to do this work with organizations, particularly around the intensive work. I ask the question, if you don't, I'm not the one to call if you're not serious about wanting to have the conversation. Don't call me. But I will be willing to have those conversations because you know what, my kids came through our systems, and they wwere dependent upon what you all provided to them, and their success was dependent on that. And I had to be a part of that process. And I'm saying now I want to be a part of the process that says that we can serve families and we can serve the whole child, just not in theory. We can really serve the whole child or the whole person or the whole family. Understanding who they are collectively and how they show up in the room. But most importantly, for us that are working within the system, we oftentimes don't really hear that how we show up in the room, all of us impact the progress and development for families. And we need to recognize that, and there's power in that. So there's an additional level of power that you each hold by virtue of the role that you serve in. And so, you know, I leave you with what will you do with your power? You know, And I see great stuff happening in the chat box. I'm here. I don't know, Mark, Nancy, and Jamal. I'm good with talking. So Tyler said he'd like to hear more about systemic racism. Yes, if you joined us in the middle, please put your name, organization, and role you're representing in the chat. Tylon, please reach out to me. I'd be happy to have additional conversations about systemic race. Any other questions or comments? I will be sharing the PowerPoint, and that PowerPoint can go out. So I'm hearing no other.
I put that in the chat several times, but you know how it is when the chat's flying by. So
Yes.
everybody that registered for this webinar will receive an email, and in that email will be the links to have access to the recording of today's event. And Lisa has told us how generous she is being in sharing her slides. And there will also be some resources available, and that'll be early next week. But as long as we have your email from registering, you will receive that information. So I think that about.
I'm sorry. I saw a couple people ask about a certificate. I don't know.
Yeah,
if you
I've answered that
Okay.
about 8 or 9 times.
I'm sorry.
And so I think, no, don't be sorry, Lisa. Everybody should have that information. And if not, you actually have it in the emails that you received from Zoom about today, and can go back there. And if not, I'm going to put my email in one more time so that if anybody is having trouble finding their certificate, whatever it is, just email me. I'll help you with it. Is that good? Anything else, Lisa, that you think we're missing?
No, I just want to thank everyone. I really appreciate the engagement and the conversation that went on in the chat. Oh, Jamal, I see another question in the chat box.
It just said, thank you so much.
Oh, okay. You're quite welcome. And thank you for your time.
So before I end out, Jamal, Mark, did either one of you have something to say?
I wanted to say thank you to Lisa for such an impactful presentation. I think it made some people think, and I think it created some frustration, which is totally understandable when we talk about this situation. But I also feel that it made people think about where we go from here. And that's always welcome. So I think this is just the beginning of a conversation. It's not the end. It's not, doesn't have all of the answers, but it promotes thought, and that's what we need. We need to think about how we better ourselves and move this conversation forward. So I thank you for that, Lisa.
You're welcome. My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. And thank you all. I think, Nancy, you have a couple closing words, and we're a couple minutes or a little bit past, so we want to honor everybody's time.
Yes, I do. I'm going to end up for us today. And I want to thank Lisa, as we all have, for being here today and for the terrific presentation. And I double everything that Jamal said. And I would also like this to take the time to say that I've had the opportunity to interact and work with Lisa most recently during the time of Black Lives Matter and her trainings for the state leadership management team. She has impacted my life, and I highly recommend her as a speaker to your organizations, which I'm sure most of you already agree with. I'd like to be sure that you're all aware of our next presentation, which is Our Kids Are Not Okay, Practicing Empathy for Everyone, Even Yourself, by Gab Esso, next Thursday at 2:30. I had put the links into the chat earlier. I see that they were just added again. And I look forward to seeing you all there.
Thank you all.
Everyone.
Thank
Have a
you.
fantastic day.